With so many headlines about China's influence in Africa, it's hard to know what's fact and what's fiction. Are we really falling into a debt trap, or is it all just exaggerated hype? In recent years, China has become a major player in African politics, and its economic engagement with the continent has been a subject of intense debate. One term that's been thrown around a lot is debt trap diplomacy. But what does it actually mean, and how does it affect African countries? The concept is simple. China lends money to African nations for infrastructure projects which they can't afford to repay. Over time, China acquires control over strategic assets and African countries lose their sovereignty. It sounds like a sinister plot, but is it really the case? The implications of debt trap diplomacy are far-reaching, affecting not just Africa, but also global politics. If true, it raises concerns about China's intentions and its growing influence in the world. That's why it's essential to examine the evidence and separate fact from fiction. China's economic engagement in Africa dates back to the 1960s, but it wasn't until the early 2000s that it began to gain momentum. The Belt and Road Initiative, launched in 2013, marked a significant turning point. This massive infrastructure project aims to connect China with Europe, Africa, and other parts of Asia, and Africa is a critical component of this plan. Today, China is Africa's largest trading partner, with bilateral trade valued at over $200 billion. Chinese investments in Africa are diverse, ranging from natural resources to manufacturing, infrastructure, and even agriculture. Countries like Angola, Ethiopia, and Nigeria have received significant investments, which have transformed their economies. But amidst all the hype, there are concerns about the nature of these investments. Are they genuine attempts to develop African economies, or are they merely tools for China to expand its influence? That's what we'll explore in this video. Debt trap diplomacy is often linked to China's lending practices, particularly through the Belt and Road Initiative. Here's how it supposedly works. China provides loans to African countries at below-market rates, which they can't afford to repay. Over time, the debt accumulates, and China demands concessions such as control over strategic assets or natural resources. The motive behind China's investments is also a subject of debate. Is it purely driven by economic interests, or are there geopolitical considerations at play? China's need for natural resources, such as oil and minerals, is well documented, but does that justify the scale of its investments in Africa? African nations are not passive recipients of Chinese aid. Many have agency and are actively engaging with China to further their own development goals. However, concerns about debt sustainability and unequal trade relationships persist. Let's take the example of Djibouti, a small country in the Horn of Africa. In 2017, Djibouti signed a deal with China to develop a free trade zone, which includes a port facility and a railway line. The deal was valued at over $3 billion, and Djibouti was expected to repay the loan with interest. However, the terms of the deal were shrouded in secrecy, leading to concerns about debt sustainability. Another example is Zambia, which has received significant investments in its mining sector. While Chinese investments have created jobs and stimulated growth, there are concerns about environmental degradation and labor exploitation. Using data and examples like these, we can see that the reality of debt trap diplomacy is more complex than a simple yes or no answer. While China's lending practices do pose risks for African countries, it's also important to acknowledge the agency and autonomy of African nations. Not everyone agrees that debt trap diplomacy is a reality, however. Some argue that it's a myth created by Western powers to discredit China's growing influence. Others claim that African countries are not passive victims of Chinese aggression, but rather active participants in shaping their own development agendas. One counter-argument is that African countries have the capacity to negotiate fair deals with China, and should be held accountable for their own decisions. Another perspective is that the concept of debt trap diplomacy is overly simplistic. failing to account for the complexity of international relations and the diverse experiences of African countries. While these counter-arguments have some merit, they don't entirely dismiss the concerns about debt sustainability and unequal trade relationships. As we weigh the evidence, it's essential to consider multiple perspectives and avoid simplistic narratives. So, is China's debt trap diplomacy in Africa real or just a myth? In conclusion, the answer lies somewhere in between. While China's lending practices do pose risks for African countries, it's also important to acknowledge the agency and autonomy of African nations. Debt trap diplomacy is not a straightforward concept, and we need to consider multiple perspectives to understand its implications. The key takeaway from this discussion is that debt trap diplomacy is not just about China's intentions, but also about the choices made by African nations. As we navigate the complexities of international relations, it's essential to have a nuanced understanding of the issues at stake. Thanks for watching, and don't forget to share your thoughts in the comments below. If you're interested in learning more about China's influence in Africa, check out other videos on the topic.